The movie starts with a man, Mark, getting treatment for some kind of war trauma. He can't seem to wake himself up and can only see blurry things. Sometime before, Mark meets his friend David and they are talking about the trip they're going to take while sat at the bar. Then their girls show up, so they all move to the dining tables and have a conversation about David and Diane's baby. Diane mentions that she wants to name their baby after Mark if it turns out to be a boy. Mark doesn't seem too excited but thanks them for the honor anyway. The two guys are now on their trip in Kurdistan. They are here taking pictures to document the Civil War because they're photojournalists. The truck arrives at the base and the soldiers receive it. The wounded are being unloaded and taken to the infirmary. Mark is taking as many pictures as he can while the chaos goes on around him. There are a lot of people who are wounded and they all need the attention of the only doctor in the area, Dr. Talzani. Inside the cave, Mark can smell the stench of rotting flesh of the wounded soldiers, but it is something they have to deal with on a daily basis. There's no clean water, no ventilation, and no medicine, so the smell is unavoidable. They get permission from the doctor and start taking some pictures. Talzani sees one man and puts a yellow label on him. He moves on, putting different color labels on the wounded soldiers, and this becomes too much for David to deal with, so he runs out. The blue labels are for the soldiers that will probably not survive, and the yellow is for the ones that have a chance. Mark continues taking pictures even when being grabbed by a dying man. All the men don't seem like they have hope as they scream from the pain. Later on, Mark takes a picture of David and goes on to talk to him. He's feeling a bit better now even though he looks terrible. David doesn't like this place. He wants to go home because Diane is due to give birth in just 2 weeks. There's a big offensive that Mark wants to catch, but David believes that's not a big deal since this seems like a never-ending war. Then see all the dead soldiers being taken out of the cave and now they must go and document it. Mark gets stopped from entering, so he goes up another way to take pictures of Talzani shooting all the soldiers to make sure they are dead. He then prays over the bodies before the rest come to cover them up. Mark is smoking, trying to make sense of all of this, when Talzani comes to smoke with him and look at the beautiful countryside view. Talzani tells Mark that he's been through 8 wars in his lifetime. He has seen his people lose all of those wars, but he can't seem to leave them here. The offense will be starting in 2 days, and Talzani advises Mark to leave before that, but Mark wants to stay. Talzani doesn't like it, but agrees to try and find Mark a spot in the convoy. That night, Mark and David are washing some clothes and making plans on how to return from the offensive. Mark wants to go document the war before they leave, but David is now feeling apprehensive since he now has a child and wife to worry about. They've been here for a month, and David thinks they have enough, but Mark feels that they need to go to the actual fighting to make their trip a success and convinces David to stay just 2 more days. The next day, the Kurds ambush the Iraqi forces, and Mark is right there taking pictures. The fighting gets intense, and Mark follows the troops into it despite David trying to keep him safe. The Kurds win, but David is not happy by how Mark put himself in danger. Mark then finds out that this isn't the end. The Kurds are going to push deeper into Iraqi territory. He tells David, who's still upset, but when he hears the news, he thinks it's a stupid idea to go along with the soldiers. David is going back even if he has to leave Mark alone. Mark then wakes up in the infirmary cave, watching the doctor put the same labels on the men laying next to him. He can't stay conscious and faints pretty quickly. Talzani asks him if he remembers being found by the river. He uncovers his legs that don't work and whispers something to his assistant. Talzani checks his legs, but Mark doesn't feel anything, but he can move his legs. He has a head wound, but luckily there is no fractured skull, just a flesh wound. Talzani now has a big decision to make, but he gives Mark the yellow label, meaning they will try to save him. In the morning, Mark is taken outside to be put in the shade. He can thankfully move his legs, but still can't get up. He feels pain, but that's a good thing. Talzani asks about David, but he left before this happened, which now seems like the right decision. That night, Mark finally manages to get himself up and use his crutches to hobble over into the cave. He finds the doctor, who is glad to see him moving around. Talzani doesn't regret having to shoot those men since he couldn't save them or even manage their pain. He needs to only focus on the ones that he can save. They share a drink, and Talzani tells Mark that a car will be headed away since the offensive has failed. He thinks Mark should get on it and have a chance to go back home. The next morning, Mark shaves as he gets ready to leave, and Talzani has saved his camera equipment. Before he leaves, Mark thanks the doctor for all his help and gets in the van to get away from the war. After some time, Mark makes it back home, still on the same crutches and wearing the same clothes. He is found by his girlfriend Alana, who is so glad to see him. He calms her down about his incident. He gets in the bath and falls asleep, so she decides to wash him and dry him off. She gets him to bed, but she is worried about him. The next morning, she has made him breakfast, but she still wants to know the truth about what happened to him. He is still insisting on the story of falling into a river and getting dragged over some rocks. He then learns that David isn't back home yet, which is confusing worrying because he left earlier than Mark. He doesn't want her to worry, so he tells her David is probably lying low to not get caught by the Iraqis. She needs to get to work, leaving him alone. He also gets to his working desk for a smoke and later goes outside to walk around in the city. He gets to the photo studio where he finds Ivan, who's very glad to see him. He gives Ivan all the films because he wants the pictures developed by lunchtime to give to the news stations in time. Ivan tries to advise Mark to stop doing the war photography, but Mark thinks he can handle it just fine. Mark gets to the pub and orders a beer before sitting down. He then gets the photos and looks at all the shots he took alone as he smokes. He remembers Talzani shooting at the hopeless soldiers. Mark then opens the blinds just as Elena arrives. She wants to see the pictures, but he doesn't want to show her the terrible war pictures, so they end up making out instead. Later that night, Mark has some flashbacks and wakes up in his chair. Elena meets Diane, who's very pregnant and still hasn't heard from David, and she's starting to get worried. Later, Mark heads out to see Amy and give her the photos that he took during the battle. He has a special set of photos he's named Triage, based on the name of the infirmary he saw in that cave. She likes the photos and will send them in, but she has another proposition for him to go to Burma for Time magazine, and with his latest work, they'll be thrilled to have him, and he agrees to it before he leaves. At a party, Elena and Diane are having fun while Mark is outside by himself. He doesn't want to do the Burma job, which is his dream. Elena suspects this is because of whatever happened in Kurdistan. She tries talking to him, but he shuts her down and goes to dance with Diane. He wants to keep dancing, so they leave him at the party. Back at home, Elena is convinced something is wrong with her man because he is acting very differently, even wanting to have a baby. That same night, Mark is still looking at the man from the cave and David on his slides. He gets a bath going, but ends up staring at himself in the mirror. When Elena comes back, she finds him passed out and takes him to the hospital. The nurse comes by to tell Elena that they removed something from his head, but she can't say much more, so Elena has to wait for the doctor. The doctor tells Elena that Mark will get better, but she removes something from his head that clearly came from a bomb. Even though he should be improving, he is getting worse, which means it is probably a psychological problem, so he needs a psychiatrist. Dr. Herzbach is with Mark in the hospital and they're going through some stuff to figure out the problem. All he sees is dead bodies in the images and tries to joke around, but that gives the doctor something to look into. Mark doesn't want to listen because the doctor has never been in war, but he points out that the person doesn't need to personally experience the trauma in order to treat it. Later on, Elena and her grandfather Morales, a psychiatrist, go through some of the pictures that Mark has published. She asked him here so he could help Mark and nothing else. She doesn't like that he treated war criminals who were murderers and evil. He tells them that he only did it to help his country because those people would have sent the country into never-ending war if he didn't treat them in time. Morales goes to see Mark in the hospital and wakes him up from his sleep. He heard a lot about Mark and is glad to meet him, but Mark was told that Morales was a fascist. Morales makes a small list of information about Mark, which tells Mark that Morales isn't actually a psychiatrist. Mark tells him about the time he was on an assignment in the Middle East and had to take pictures of a boy getting shot. Mark feels responsible for the boy's death, but Morales points out that he needs to find forgiveness within himself to be better. Mark is finally released from the hospital, and Morales is there with Elena to send them home. At home, he is practicing with Morales on his walk, while Elena comes with news about David. He's missing from his hotel room. Elena leaves to be with Diane, and Morales stays with Mark to ask about another war story. This time it is in Uganda, and Mark saw some crazy scenes of human bones and even took some pictures. Outside, Morales is pushing Mark down the street as they talk about his travels as a photographer. Morales raises a point that maybe Mark is glad to not be one of the dead, and that pisses Mark off so much that he leaves Morales there after telling him to stay away. Mark is asleep at home when Morales wakes him again so he can get up to exercise. He takes a look at the newspaper to see a tragedy. Morales comes with some coffee and gets Mark to show him the river he fell in on the wall. Morales then asks where David was standing during the explosion, and now Mark has to tell the truth. Mark remembers calling for David as he walked away. He actually chose to follow David and not the soldiers. They walked to escape to the border through the mountains, but David was blown up by a landmine. Mark had tried to save him, but his leg was blown off and Mark couldn't do much about it, so he carried David down the mountain. Hearing this made Diane break down and caused her to go into labor, and they all left with her, leaving Mark all alone with his sudden realization of what he did. The baby is born, and Mark comes to see Diane. She can't stop crying, and Mark apologizes for keeping the secret from her. She wants to know where David is buried, but Mark just walks out. Elena comes looking for him and only finds Diane, who tells her to be nice to Mark. Mark is on the roof, not knowing what to do with himself when Morales sees him, but Elena and Morales stop him. He remembers trying to carry David back because he wanted to take him home, but after walking for hours, he fell into the river. Mark couldn't breathe breathe, so he had to let David go in the water, letting his friend sink to save himself. The movie ends with Mark being comforted by his woman as he holds those blue and yellow labels given by the doctor.